Hi everybody, and welcome to the latest in Undercurrent series of interviews with some of the top figures in the seafood sector. I'm Neil Ramsden, Deputy Editor of Undercurrent News, and today I'm speaking to Dr Darian McBain, Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Thai Union. Darian likely needs little introduction from me, but has held a role with Thai Union, one of the largest companies in the tuna and farm shrimp sectors globally, for some 6 years, and has just been appointed by the UN Global Compact as the Sustainable Development Goals pioneer for a sustainable ocean economy. Hi, Darian.
Hi, Neil. Thank you for the introduction. Lovely to be here.
So I wanted to start off by asking about that appointment by the UN Global Compact and how that relates to the sort of issues of the climate crisis and seafood supply, essentially. I know you've mentioned before that there's sort of risks to seafood supply from the climate crisis.
So the SDG Pioneer Award was obviously to everyone at Thai Union. I was just the one who managed to get honoured for it. And it was in recognition for progress towards a sustainable ocean economy, which is really interesting. It's kind of bringing together all of the different aspects that we've been working on in our sea change sustainability strategy for the past 6 years. And knowing that we have integrated the Sustainable Development Goals into everything that we do. But going to your point about climate change, I think we're starting to hear more about the blue economy, blue ocean finance, because if we're really going to have any resolution to climate change issues, we absolutely have to value the oceans. There's this group called the High Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy who made an estimate that 21% approximately of the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that we're going to need to sit within the Paris Declaration targets are going to come from ocean-based solutions. So as a very large seafood company, we absolutely need to be working on climate change.
And how has climate change kind of had a knock-on effect in terms of things like modern slavery and IUU fishing?
Well, I think as fish become more scarce, and that could be due to a number of reasons, whether that is overfishing or it could be climate change as fish are migrating, different ocean currents, the availability of their food sources. But when the fish migrate away from their usual areas, then you'll find that more catch effort is required to catch the fish that perhaps the fishers were getting in the past. When that puts a pressure on them for the income that they're getting for the catch per effort, then I think you start to see pressure on, are they fishing in the correct places? Are they legally fishing? You might see downward pressure on wages. So we really do see the risks to livelihoods will increase as the risk of climate change increases.
Yeah, and it feels like well, maybe it's just being better reported, but the last year or so, it seems like there's been more incidences of sort of the fishing sector being unsafe for crews. I don't know, well, that's obviously something that you've addressed in your supply chain, but how do you think the private sector can sort of look at that and other issues sort of in the near future?
So I think it's an interesting observation that it's being reported more, which is good because I think society is probably valuing the work that fishers are doing more. And indeed, through the pandemic that we're still living in, you've seen the rights of seafarers discussed more as they haven't been able to come to land to change over crews. You've had people stuck on land, you've had people stuck on vessels. They've had a very difficult time. And it makes us think about that whole 90% of everything that's transported by sea. How are we going to actually support seafarers, with fishers and fishermen being one part of that sector? Now you're starting to see more reports on, I think, human rights at sea and work conditions, partly because you're seeing more regulations and legislation that have an impact, whether it's the UK Modern Slavery Act and reporting under that, or particularly in the US Customs and Border Protection and their investigations and the withhold release orders, but also civil society, so groups like Human Rights at Sea, who are really bringing these issues to the fore and flagging them. And you're right, Thai Union have put our Vessel Code of Conduct in place in 2017. And so we've been working to conduct essentially social audits at sea since then. And a really important part of that is that we conduct worker interviews. So whenever we're doing one of these audits against our Vessel Code of Conduct, we also speak to the workers to understand, well, what is their perspective on what's happening? What would really make their lives better? What are the key impacts that we're seeing?
And I guess you need the crews to be able to trust that they can be sort of completely honest with their employers as well.
They do, and so they are always interviewed away from their employers, but some things are really simple. There was a great example that one of my team members shared with me. I think it was from work being done with some vessels in Ghana in our supply chain. And the crew interviews revealed that they said, you know, they don't have any privacy on board the vessels, and they've gone out to sea for sometimes months at a time. And so we helped make sure that they installed some basic privacy screens around toilet, bathroom areas so people could get changed. And the crew was so happy to finally have some privacy. And of course, for us, that makes total sense. We're so used to having that privacy. It wasn't a high cost solution, but it was a solution born of talking to the people on board these vessels who work in those conditions and who know what some of the things are that can help their workday.
Yeah. And you mentioned the pandemic a short while ago. I wanted to ask more specifically, do you think that the last year or so, with quite a boom in demand for canned tuna, has that brought with it sort of increased traceability for that particular sector?
I'm not sure if it's brought increased traceability, certainly not for Thai Union because we'd already been working on that for many years. But what I think it has highlighted is the importance of having a strong relationship with your suppliers and your supply chain. So some companies, you know, found themselves out of their raw products. You know, they just couldn't connect with their supply chain because there had been so many tiers along. But Thai Union has worked very hard, particularly with our tuna suppliers, but all fish suppliers, because we've been doing the work on, say, our Vessel Code of Conduct through the fishery improvement projects. And so when the pandemic hit, we were able to use our global supply chains and maneuver so that we could have continuous supply. And I actually put that down to really good relationships and long-term relationships with our suppliers.
And maybe linked to that, do you see kind of more use of things like blockchain technology in the canned tuna sector coming in?
So we have worked on traceability systems with blockchain, and particularly some of our customers in Europe have been putting our products going into the system on a blockchain ledger. That isn't really the difficulty in that we have all of the traceability information and we can provide it to them, they can put it onto the digital ledger. I think what the question will be in the future is how valid is the data that you're putting onto a blockchain system? And so that's where we're starting to look at things like electronic monitoring so that you can have extra levels of verification of data and perhaps new ways of gathering that data so that you can make sure that if, for example, a customer says we want this on a blockchain ledger, then you know that you're putting the correct information on there. And then I think blockchain also has some really important role to play in more of the human rights space or the worker rights space. So we've been doing a project in Thailand looking at particularly migrant workers and how you can have secure documentation so that their passport, for example, or work permit can be on, a blockchain so that it's immutable, nobody can take it away from them. And I know that the pandemic has actually helped to move some of these systems as we look at how do you move more quickly through airports. I've heard some really great examples of countries having blockchain-based identity systems. So I think that's probably some movement as well.
Okay. And one of the other points that I wanted to touch on was the prospects for biodiversity in terms of corporate agendas and how they can match that to climate action. And mentioned in the notes were the task force on nature-related financial disclosures.
Sorry, Neil, I've lost you for a minute. Perhaps you can repeat that last question.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to touch on one of the other points in the notes, which was the prospects for biodiversity in terms of corporate agendas. And alongside that was the task force on nature-related financial disclosures.
So I think biodiversity is going to come rapidly up the agenda. From our perspective, we've certainly been focusing on our key species, essentially our target species. So tuna would be a good example, and looking at the stocks of tuna. But once you start to take a more holistic biodiversity approach, you realize that, juvenile tuna are feeding on phytoplankton. As they get older, they're feeding on other smaller fish. If you want to maintain tuna species, you actually have to maintain that whole web and biodiverse system. And you similarly start to look at, perhaps the land-based ecosystem, mangroves and coral reefs, which are the breeding grounds for most fish and fisheries. And I think you will start to see corporates speaking more about the importance of biodiversity. In fact, I was reading an article the other day that said the biodiversity crisis is probably equal to the climate change crisis, which seems like way too much to be handling, but it's something that we need to start looking at, because obviously you don't want to get to the crisis point before you even start to integrate this into business practices. And then, as you said, there is the task force for nature-related financial disclosures. So they've just appointed 2 chairs to that task force. And similarly to the task force for climate-related financial disclosures, this one is going to start to look at what are the nature-based or nature-related disclosures that need to be made for potentially banks and investors and other institutions to really judge the performance of companies, but also ultimately governments as well.
Okay. And I know relatively recently, Thai Union had its first sustainability-linked loan, and connected to that sort of issue of green financing. I wanted to ask about Thai Union's sort of interest in the idea of blue carbon credits, which was a term that I'd only heard of this year, but that was probably me being slow on the uptake. But yeah, is that something big in the future, do you think?
So in the blue carbon credits, it is interesting. We started looking at that last year, and I think like most of the ocean space, it's underinvested at the moment. So the AAA rated, gold standard, verified carbon credits tend to be land-based. So in that sense, you say that they're green. And when I started looking into what blue carbon credits there are actually relatively few projects across the world that have an ocean-related impact, which is what would make them blue. And so I do think that there's going to be increasing demand, as I mentioned before, particularly for things like mangroves, which can store up to 10 times more carbon dioxide than terrestrial-based trees, but also coral reefs and seagrass beds. but probably there needs to be more work done to verify that carbon capture and storage. So my guess is that it's going to be a growing market. It's something that we will also need for biodiversity preservation. So it's kind of going with both crises, the climate change crisis and the biodiversity crisis. But at the moment, I think it's still underinvested, as many ocean projects still are.
Okay. Moving a bit more specifically onto kind of your tuna supply chain. I think at the last InfoFish conference, you'd noted that Thai Union was ahead of its 2025 targets, particularly relating to fishery improvement programs. And then in the name of continuous improvement, you're sort of always setting new targets. So I wondered if you could give an idea of what your targets look like at the moment.
Sure. So in 2016, we set out what we called our tuna commitment very creatively, which was to make sure that our branded tuna products were coming from MSC certified fisheries or fishery improvement projects that were moving towards MSC certification. And our target there was that we would reach a goal of 75% by 2020. And so what I spoke about when we were at Interfish is by the end of 2020, we'd actually exceeded that target. So of our branded tuna, 87% was coming from either a FIP or an MSC certified fishery, which is great. But that, of course, is not where we can stop. And so now we're setting our 2025 goals, and we're actually looking at how do we move beyond only MSC certification. And we're calling this operational best practice. Now, the MSC certification of a fishery, I think, is still fundamental. That is taking care of the environmental aspects. And of course, you have the chain of custody as well, which is also contributing to our traceability efforts. But then we're starting to see so many other requirements, both in terms of what we need as a business, but also from regulators and from other stakeholders. So that would include understanding worker conditions at sea. It would include, what we're doing with abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear or all sorts of marine pollution. Climate change, that doesn't come up really in the MSC standard. And so when you layer all of these things on, we're saying that for the fisheries, we want them to move towards Marine Stewardship Council certification. But for our 2025 commitment, operational best practice is moving towards reducing any chance of IUU fishing or modern slavery. And it's all of these layers on the fundamental basis of Marine Stewardship Council certification, but the other requirements that we must meet.
And in terms of those other layers, do you need your suppliers to meet kind of other certifications on those, or do your customers now sort of trust you to implement your own best practices?
At the moment, I don't think there's any one certification that covers all of those aspects of what we're calling operational best practice. Most people are familiar, obviously, with the MSC certification, but when you start to look at climate change, for example, that isn't taken into account in the certification. At the moment, even with our vessel code of conduct, there are quite a few different codes and approaches. So there isn't one standard that everybody's working towards. And I think collaboration is going to be important as we all talk about how do we move forwards. But then some of the big collaborations like CBOS, so Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship, we're working towards the goals that have been set out within those partnerships. And I think as long as the industry starts to align now, we will all get to a much better point. But it's still quite new working out, as I said, for us, what operational best practice is.
So, yeah, I wanted to ask maybe sort of a subjective question possibly, but I think I read you're involved in 9 fishery improvement projects at the moment. In terms of a long-term view, are you sort of on the verge of having quite a lot more sustainable tuna volumes that you can choose from compared to, I don't know, sort of 5-10 years ago?
I think on the verge is a good way to put it. We've obviously put the effort into working with many partners to establish the FIPs. They're all rated FIPs, so they're between A and C, so they are all making progress. One of the interesting things when taking this on a corporate scale, which I think is actually quite a fast scale because everybody wants the fish now, is that we really need governments to play their parts. Very often, governments and governance are one of the reasons that we can't meet all of the requirements of certification. And we see the discussions going on with the RFMOs at the moment. Until governments properly regulate their fisheries, I don't think it can all be down to industry and industry collaborating with NGOs. And I was on a discussion just last night with a UN group, and that all come to a similar conclusion. We actually need governments to step in and help regulate fisheries and the requirements on fisheries so that we can all have more sustainable seafood. So that's my call out, that, the corporates are there, the NGOs are there, but we need the governments to really step in so that we can have more volumes of sustainable seafood.
I should probably know this, but are you kind of well invested in the IOTC in terms of the pressure that's on the fishery management there at the moment?
We are, and we're also founding members of the ISSF, so International Seafood Sustainability Foundation. So a lot of our advocacy efforts go through the efforts of the ISSF.
Okay. Yeah, there's well, in the UK we've seen a lot of retailers and the kind of downstream processors here have really started speaking about that this year as well.
It's a concern, and it's the kinds of decisions and governance decisions that need to be made so that we have sustainable stocks for the future.
Okay. And obviously short-term profits, at least, isn't the sort of the goal of sustainability initiatives, but do you see that you're able to charge more for kind of sustainability or sustainably certified tuna, or do the sort of the profits end up going back into the supply chain to back up the investments that you have to make?
So I think sustainably supplied tuna and all sustainably supplied seafood is becoming table stakes. If we just walked away from it, then probably we wouldn't have the fantastic large customers that we do, because as you know, many retailers also have requirements for sustainable seafood, and we need to meet those requirements. A lot of the money goes into the supply chain. So if we look at MSC, there is a cost just for the chain of custody certification and having the logo on pack. There is a cost in establishing fishery improvement projects. There is a cost in auditing against the vessel code of conduct. But at the same time, Thai Union have committed to saying, well, this is the way that we do business. So that is the cost of business for us. It isn't that there's an alternative, cheaper way that we could go about it. And as I said, I think there are benefits that come with that. My example before of the good connection that we have with our suppliers that served us well during the pandemic in 2020. That was never obviously the aim of doing the sustainability work, but that has definitely been a good outcome that has commercial benefits, that we have that sustainability of supply.
Okay. And yeah, moving away from tuna, I wanted to ask about still a fishery management issue, and still probably an example of governments needing to be more involved in fisheries management. But I wanted to ask for your take on the sort of North Atlantic pelagics that you work with in terms of sort of monitoring and traceability there.
So we see this as an area that we would certainly like to be more involved in and improved. And you may have seen that we announced our partnership with the Nature Conservancy earlier this year. And part of that work is moving beyond tuna to other species to get more involved in the traceability and the regulation of those fisheries. I do think they're under threat partly due to the lack of regulation. And part of what the work we're going to do with the Nature Conservancy is to engage more with governments to make sure that those fisheries are more sustainably managed.
Okay. And I'm not sure if we touched on it already under the tuna discussions, but what are your kind of targets or views on kind of fish aggregating devices in tuna over the next few years?
I think fish aggregating devices have their role to play. I mean, looking just fundamentally at the device itself, we need to make sure that doesn't become abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear. So some of the work that we're doing is on management plans for FADs. I think there's agreement across a number of RFMOs that there need to be limits on the number of FADs. But what we're going to start to see as the essentially scope 3 emissions, so the carbon footprint of sourcing tuna becomes better known and perhaps more of concern to supply chains. As you see our ultimate customers setting net zero targets, it's going to come down the pressure in the supply chain. And I read a study recently that showed that per seine caught skipjack, I think it was on a FAD, is the lowest carbon footprint, tuna that you could have, and it was comparable to the carbon footprint of tofu, so an alternative protein, as opposed to, I think they compared it to a Poland line caught fish, which had a much higher carbon footprint. And so you do need to balance all of these different issues. Is your main concern the carbon footprint? Is it entanglement of species? Is it overfishing? And I think we take a view that we're agnostic about gear type. It's not the gear type necessarily that is evil. It's making sure that the setting in which it's used, so the fishery in which it's used, is managed sustainably.
Sure. Okay. And then, given time constraints, I hadn't kind of prepared a huge long list on farm shrimp sustainability, but maybe if I could ask you kind of what's the key concern for Thai Union over the next few years in terms of kind of the farm shrimp supply?
I think farm shrimp and aquaculture in general is really ripe for even further innovation, particularly in Southeast Asia. So you have companies that are coming up, and some of which we've invested in through our corporate venture fund, which are really focusing on monitoring, so targeted monitoring, being really precise about the feed and the water quality issues that you have in shrimp farms. I think feed continues to be an area with high potential for innovation, whether it's alternative ingredients to the fish meal and the fish oils, or we're seeing some really interesting commitments from the large feed companies to deforestation-free feeds. And so I think that's another interesting area. And the third area, kind of going back to your point about blue carbon that I've seen discussion on, although not in practice, is the idea of intensification of aquaculture, and particularly shrimp farms. But given where they're located, can they be co-located with mangroves so that you almost have a natural capital offset going on a particular farm. So it's giving back to the environment while you're also getting productivity and food out. So I think those are areas that we'll start to see a lot more work on in coming years.
Yeah, I've seen the kind of mangrove innovation. I don't know if it is innovation. It might be sort of going back to how it used to be done.
It might be going back to the good old times.
Yeah, but I've seen that mentioned in Vietnam recently. Is that something that applies to kind of Thailand and other Southeast Asian countries as well then?
It certainly could. I mean, many of the countries in Southeast Asia certainly had very large mangrove forests. I think Indonesia is the most mangrove forested country in the world. Shrimp farms tend to be located in places where mangroves either currently are or they used to be. And so there does seem to be a natural synergy there, although I don't think we collectively as an industry have done perhaps enough research on how this could work at the moment. And it's something that I've discussed with the Nature Conservancy. They're certainly looking at that as well.
Okay. And yeah, I wanted to ask quickly on the latest in terms of the alternative shrimp feed ingredients, the sort of projects that you've worked with, Callista and Corbion, in recent years. Yeah, just what the latest on those projects is essentially.
So we're still working with them, definitely still using ingredients from Corbion. Callista, I had some discussions recently. They're ramping up their production and the different plants around the world. I think they remain good options. I mentioned our corporate venture fund. We have invested in some other alternative ingredients that could be used for shrimp feed or fish feeds in general. So I do think feed in aquaculture remains one of those areas for innovation. I don't think we're at the end of that innovation chain yet.
Sure. Okay. Well, yeah, I have exhausted my list of questions. So yeah, unless there's anything else you wanted to add, I will say thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Lovely to have a chat. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And yeah, have a good week.
Okay, thanks a lot.